Well, let's stay with our top story this morning. The former president's legal team pushing one more time to have the Constitutional Court suspend his imminent arrest by the police. As we know of just before midnight last night, clearly the application was not enough and the former president had to hand himself over to authorities. But now what happens next? And was it enough to try and keep the former president out? Well, let's speak to International Commission of Jurists legal officer. It's Tanveer Jeewa. Tanveer, good morning to you. Obviously, this last-ditch attempt to have the stay of prison wasn't successful for last night. But just help the common man like myself, the common person, understand what happens now? What happens next as of this morning?
Well, good morning to you too, and thank you very much for having me here today. Well, I think what was very important for all of us to note is that yesterday there was no application made, but a letter sent to the Constitutional Court on behalf of Mr. Zuma's lawyers. Now, the Constitutional Court has a general rule that it doesn't engage with litigants through correspondence like letters, and the simple reason behind that rule is that it doesn't want to lower itself to the level of engaging with litigants because it needs to stay on a higher level like an impartial judge. So in that case, it wouldn't engage with letters. So really, I think to anyone who's quite familiar with constitutional law, it did seem like a very futile but desperate attempt at the very last minute to kind of get them to review the order, when essentially, I think a lot of lawyers have said this before, to do that they would have had to put a stay application at the Constitutional Court, which they had not done earlier.
And I think a lot of people, Tanveer, over the past few weeks, when I say a lot of people, I'm really just referring to social media. I don't know a lot of people, but critics and those on social media are saying that Zuma's legal team should have done better. And you just touched on that, didn't you? That they should have put an appeal in at the Constitutional Court level last week already, or when the matter was handed down. What do you think the reason was to not do it there, but rather try and take the fight to the Pietermaritzburg High Court?
I think, as you mentioned, on social media, and maybe a lot of people as well have been talking about a Stalingrad tactic, or rather delay tactics as to why Mr. Zuma's lawyers went to the High Court. I think there's no legal reason one can get out of it, because I think we're all very familiar with the fact that a rescission application, which is the application that they made at the Constitutional Court, does not suspend the operation of the order. So even if that application had been granted and they had heard it, it would have made no difference to Mr. Zuma ending up in jail, which is why usually these applications come in two parts, which is the rescission application and the stay application. And to put it very simply, what the stay application simply does is it suspends the operation of the order, which means that while the rescission application is being decided, Mr. Zuma would not have had to go to jail. Now, the reason why I think a lot of people are just suspecting that Mr. Zuma's lawyers went to the High Court because they don't know if they would have been successful at the Constitutional Court, but rather it's causing a bit more of a delay and a bit more of a confusion. And if you've listened to the hearing, if I'm not mistaken, on Tuesday, while the State Capture Commission was making the argument that the only court that can decide on this application is the Constitutional Court. So a lot of us have seen it as a bit of a delay tactic and a bit of a confusing tactic, because I think a lot of lawyers are now undecided. Just
help me and viewers understand this morning the legal steps next. We know the 12th of July, which is next Monday. We know that the Concord is going to hear this rescission application by the former president. What happens with the Pietermaritzburg High Court now legally? Is that just no longer in play, or is there still something that the Zuma team can do?
Well, interestingly, I think a lot of lawyers would have said that the stay application at the High Court never had any weight, because a lower court does not bind the Constitutional Court or any higher court for that matter. So the moment the Constitutional Court made that order, the only court that can review this order or change it is very much the Constitutional Court, which is why the confusion was there that they even approached the High Court to begin with. So now the confusion as to why I think the matter was even heard and judgment was reserved is it's getting a bit more complicated, and some people aren't sure what happens if the stay application is granted. But in my personal opinion, if on Friday the judge in the High Court decides to grant the stay application, to me it means nothing, because as mentioned, a lower court cannot change the Constitutional Court's order. It's the Constitutional Court remains the apex court of the land. But in terms of legal procedure, if the stay application is granted, I'm assuming the State Capture Commission will immediately challenge it to the Constitutional Court, in which case the operation of the order will be suspended. But I am very doubtful that now that that President Zuma is in prison, the stay application will be granted, because it simply would not be able to do that.
And I think it's at this point, Jovi, very important to remind viewers that this has got nothing to do with the fraud and corruption case that the former president is fighting in court. So this is merely the contempt of court case. What does happen if we kick the can down a little further down the road? What does happen with that much bigger court case, respectfully, that's still coming up for the fraud and corruption if the former president is still incarcerated at that point? Does it have any bearing on prison time served, or how the court will view the former president's case for fraud and corruption?
Well, I personally wouldn't think so, because it's so separated from the case, and in this event, you don't want to prejudice Mr. Zuma, especially because he's kind of pushed that narrative that he is not being treated like any other accused or any other person that's standing trial. So in this case, it's simply based on the contempt order. And I think, interestingly enough, the viewers should also note that the State Capture Commission has said at the Constitutional Court that it's no longer interested in hearing from Mr. Zuma and it's in getting his testimony. So I would argue that there is no reason why this would necessarily be held against Mr. Zuma. If anything, I think Mr. Zuma will hopefully have learned his lesson and now actually comply to court orders.
I appreciate your time in speaking to us. Wonderful analysis. International Commission of Jurists Legal Officer, it's Tanveer Jeewa.